very exciting story of a city and its people. It will be an adventure that will open new sights. It is a story of a city seeking new horizons in a resolute contest with great challenges. That city is Detroit.
Welcome back. What you just saw were scenes from a soon-to-be-released documentary entitled Detroit Under Stress. And as you saw very graphically portrayed there, the historical fact that Detroit in the late 1960s, early 1970s was in essence the murder capital of the United States. The name again of the documentary is Detroit Under Stress. That is a double entendre, stress, S-T-R-E-S-S, an acronym for a special unit and policy of the Detroit Police Department back in 1971. And we welcome via FaceTime from Phoenix, Arizona, David Van Wee. David Van Wee, the documentarian, the filmmaker, the producer behind this documentary, Detroit Under Stress. David Van Wee, thanks so much for making time for us this morning on NewsMax TV.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me on.
So, David, let's begin with the acronym. What did those letters that spell stress stand for among officers and city fathers there in Detroit circa 1971?
Right, so STRESS was the acronym for Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. Back then in 1970, the crime rate in Detroit was through the roof. You had a 300% increase in the murder rate. You had a 600% rate increase in the robbery rate from a decade earlier. And so Detroit was really struggling with how to deal with this massive influx of crime. They were just coming off the '67 riot rebellion and really trying to figure out how do we proactively go out and try and stop this crime. And with the robbery rate so high, that was what they were focusing on, because by the time the police got there, after a robbery had occurred, in all likelihood, once they took your wallet or stole whatever they wanted, they would kill you. So when the police get there, you're already dead. There's no witnesses. There's no leads. So how do you go about fighting this crime? How do you go about curbing this violence? And so they decided to come up with a special unit that was an undercover decoy unit. And they asked for volunteers to go out and wander the worst parts of Detroit late at night and try and get robbed, because they thought if we're the victim instead of a citizen, then we could make the arrest. So they worked in teams of 2 to 4. Your backup men were arguably about 100 yards away. And the decoy, the person who was out there trying to get robbed, once they were approached, you're talking about maybe a foot or 2 of distance between you and the robber. So it was very dangerous work. The likelihood of your backup men getting there in time to help you was very minimal. And so after the first year of operating this unit, Detroit became the #1 city for police civilian fatalities. And it was also the #1 city where police were getting killed. By the time they were to reach back to pretend to get their wallet, they were going for their hideaway gun. And they ended up shooting several people. In fact, it turned out it was about 26 fatal shootings. It was 26 fatal shootings. Through the span of the unit.
So, David, as you chronicle this, David, as you're chronicling what happened there, and I want to get into some of the figures a bit later, but you have a personal interest in telling this story. Tell us how the concept for making this documentary, Detroit Under Stress, came about.
So the short answer to that is my father was one of those stress officers. Growing up, I didn't know what my dad did necessarily. I knew my mother would tell me he worked for the city. I never saw my dad in uniform. And the way this started, when I first learned about it, I was in college and was going out shooting, and my dad brought his revolver. Well, I noticed at the bottom of his revolver, he had a couple of notch marks. And I asked my dad, "Dad, why do you have notch marks on the bottom of your gun?" And his response was, "Why the hell do you think I have notch marks on the bottom of my gun?" So I get these little bits and pieces about what happened. And about 3 years ago, my dad finally told me the whole story. And it's truly an unbelievable story. You won't believe the twists and turns and what these officers went through and what the community went through, quite frankly, with this stress unit.
And that stress unit, in terms of the cops setting themselves up, the term was decoy, but in essence, they became targets. This select group of cops working this stress program. What was the story on crime in Detroit? Did robberies come down? Did the murder rate come down once the stress program was instituted?
So it's interesting, as soon as stress started, they started to see a decrease in the robbery rate and a decrease in crime. Over the length of the unit, they saw a decrease in the robbery rate of 15%. However, the murder rate continued to climb to over 1,000. And if you look at Chicago last year, it was 750, and we were all thrown back on our heels, imagine 25% more, and there you are in Detroit at the time. So although they were having an impact on the robbery rate and the crime rate, the murder rate was still going up significantly high.
David Van Wee, documentarian, film producer, the mastermind behind the new documentary Detroit Under Stress. David, I think back to Detroit of the 1960s, and it certainly was a study in contrasts. The big three, really big four automakers at that time, American companies headquartered in Detroit. In the African-American community, the rise of Motown, called Hitsville, USA, and the creative and commercial entrepreneurial spirit of Berry Gordy there in Detroit. Just the neighborhood singing groups who achieved national prominence. And then you also think about 1968 and the Detroit Tigers winning the World Series, coming from behind. I believe they were down 3-1 to the Cardinals. In fact, Dr. Ben Carson, now HUD secretary, former presidential candidate, he and I had occasion to talk about that 1968 Tiger team. Yet, what has transpired in Detroit in the wake of the demise of the stress program, as you take the long view, historically, David Van Wee, is it where the stress program really was the last coordinated effort to directly deal with trying to find a deterrent to the robberies and violent crime in Detroit? It was extreme. We can talk about the legal philosophy behind it and the attacks that may come from civil libertarians. But in retrospect, was really that the last gasp of the Detroit establishment in prosperous times to deal with the burgeoning violence?
Well, it depends on who you ask. There's different methods to dealing with crime. There's different views on how to deal with crime. And, Detroit, even though in the 60s was that, city, the shining city on a hill, there was underlying racial tensions in Detroit since it was founded. I mean, you had race riots in 1863, 1943, 1967, some call it a riot, some call it a rebellion. And even though in 1964 you had the civil rights movement pass, Detroit didn't change much. They were still, even though on the surface looked like it was thriving, which it was, the racial tensions there were massive. They were segregating the black population into two specific areas called Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, ironically enough. And it was very tough for the African Americans in that community to have any sense of empowerment in the city. And it kind of came to fruition in 1967, where they had that massive riot or rebellion. And then, yes, and so then they decided to implement stress after that when the crime continued to get bad. Now, when stress was disbanded, the crime rate went all the way back up to pre-stress levels, and the next year it goes even higher. Now, from the other viewpoint, the other side, they thought that if you were to integrate the police so that it reflected the community, that would solve the problem. Remember, in 1970, the Detroit Police Department was predominantly white, and the crime was mostly in the African-American neighborhoods. So you're already kind of creating an impossible situation. Not only be having these officers go into these areas and decoy and have all these fatal shootings, but just the makeup itself. But I think, as we look through the prism of time here, I think we can see that just having the police department reflect the community doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And, we can see Detroit continue to slide to even a couple years ago where they went into bankruptcy, and now they're still trying to dig their way out.
And as they try to dig their way out, you have done your digging and put together a compelling documentary. Tell you what, let's take a look at another excerpt of some scenes from the documentary Detroit Under Stress.
The news media would blow everything that happened at Stress out of proportion and made us feel like we were mass murderers.
They were judge, jury, and executioner.
We knew that if one of our guys got shot even or killed, the other guy was going to go down.
Detroit police had killed more people per capita than any other city in this country, and those people were black.
So you're showing the different points of view, the different arguments, the different rationales that existed in Detroit of the early 1970s, and a debate that continues to this day, David Van Wee. Just want to ask you about the notion of using decoys as entrapment. As you look back on that program in which your father participated, on balance, was it good for Detroit or bad for Detroit? 1 minute remains, David. I'd like your perspective on it.
Tough question. So as far as entrapment's concerned, it's never entrapment when it happens to you. They were not using, $100 bills or expensive watches or anything like that. They were wandering the street, pretending to be drunk or lost. The program was effective in that area, but I think it just comes down to the question: how do you proactively police? I think that community policing and this type of proactive policing are two very different things. And I think until we come to some understanding of being able to utilize those two things in order to combat crime on two different levels, I think we're going to kind of be in the same situation we're at now, where police and community are just not getting along because we have this one narrow view of what policing is, and that's pretty much coming after the fact. And I don't know that's going to help crime. So it's a tough issue. Some people were for stress and some against.
It isn't. And of course, the conclusions will be left in the eye of the beholder, as so many people take a look at Detroit Under Stress in the days and months ahead. David Van Wee, filmmaker, producer, mastermind of this documentary, talking about a troubled and still controversial time in our history. David Van Wee, we thank you very much for your time. Now, continuing on the subject of Detroit, you may recall that then candidate Donald Trump went to the Motor City, also with him, Detroit native Dr. Ben Carson, and the mainstream media treated that as an oddity. Everything, it seemed, all the coverage of Donald Trump was that of curiosity or a reality television show or something that was askance. Look, there's no secret. Big media hates Donald Trump. They've declared war on him, and that was predicted in the great book from our friend David Horowitz, Big Agenda, President Trump's Plan to Save America. Now, Big Agenda's already reached the #1 spot at Amazon.com in several different categories. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list. Big Agenda reveals President Trump's plan to take down President Obama's executive order and dismantle his liberal agenda. You need to know what this president plans to do, and you will find out in Big Agenda. Rush Limbaugh says every conservative needs to read this book, and here's what you need to do. Take advantage of a free offer, a special offer from those of us here at NewsMax. Enjoy a savings of over $30. For more info, bigagenda911.com or call that 800 number you see.